We're about to show you the top 20 biggest misconceptions in pickleball and where the truth actually lies according to the rules.
Subscribe if you like our content, and let's get right into the first one.
We'll start with one of the craziest and actually most common scenarios you might run into. It's when the ball bounces on one side of the court and manages to come back over. This typically happens when the ball has a lot of backspin, so it's rotating towards me in this case, hits one side of the net, and then comes all the way back over. Most players think the point is either over or it's a let, or they just get confused and don't know what to do. So we're gonna break down exactly what the rules are in this scenario. When the ball bounces back over the court, this creates the only opportunity in pickleball that you can reach over the net to continue playing the ball. So if I manage to hit enough slice that the ball is going to bounce over, Shay can realize that the ball is coming back over the net, and once the ball crosses the plane of the net, he is able to begin to reach over and hit it back onto my side. And if Shay for some reason doesn't manage to make contact with the ball or hit it back on my side of the court, then it's gonna count as a double bounce like normal, and that's going to be my point.
Perhaps even more misunderstood is once I cross the plane of the net to hit this ball, I can hit it into his court or I can hit it into the net. But if I hit the net, it doesn't just automatically end the rally. If this ball bounces somehow, he can hit it before it touches the ground and we continue playing like normal. One of the most commonly misunderstood scenarios is how you re-establish yourself out of the kitchen once you step into it. So just a reminder, you can stand in here all you want to, you just can't take a ball out of the air before it bounces. But there are some scenarios where I let the ball bounce, I hit it, and then I need to step back before making a volley. If I were to step into the kitchen to hit a dink, I need to make sure that I establish both of my feet back inside of the court of play before hitting a volley. Just because both feet end up being established by the time you finish hitting the shot doesn't mean that you're established when you hit the shot, and that would also be a fault. A really common scenario you might see this is in an Ernie. Someone might step across into the kitchen and then step outside of the kitchen and think that they're okay because they have one foot outside of the kitchen. But in fact, if you ever step into the kitchen, you need to establish both feet outside to be legally able to hit a volley after that point. One place where this goes uncalled all the time is when you're hitting an overhead. Very often people will step into the court to push off and hit an overhead, and they think that they've established by having their right foot plant down, but really you have to actually put both feet down and then you can go for an overhead.
Speaking of Ernies, there's actually a big misconception as to how Ernies work in pickleball. So let's say I'm getting ready to hit a Ernie, I get outside of the kitchen like this, and I see a ball coming my way right here. I could try to make contact right here, and a lot of players think this is a legal Ernie, but there's one problem with that scenario. My paddle is beyond the plane of the net. I cannot make contact with the ball when my paddle is past the vertical plane of the net. In order to hit a legal Ernie, I actually have to hit it once it comes past this plane of the net right here, and now I can make contact. So when you hit Ernies, be sure that you don't stretch too far and prematurely hit the ball, which is actually illegal. But once you do make contact with the ball, you are allowed to pass the plane of the net with your paddle. So when you do make contact with the ball, then you can finish past the net. That's fine, but contact has to occur before the plane of the net. And yes, this also includes your body. So it's not just where the paddle makes contact. You are allowed to make contact here and your body can finish past the net. That's completely fine. The point is the rules change as soon as you make contact on your side of the court. The problem is most players try to make contact on the opponent's side of the court, and that's legal. You also cannot stand on your opponent's side of the court either. Even if you make contact on this side of the net, your body cannot pass the net x-axis. A problem a lot of players run into is they go for an Ernie, don't even make contact with the Ernie, but finish with their momentum into their opponent's side of the court. And that's actually a fault. That is illegal. The point ends right there because you passed the plane of the net.
There's a big misconception about what parts of the net are inbounds and what parts are out of bounds. First, let's cover the outside net post. This is a permanent object. It's always in the ground right here. This is always out of bounds. So if you hit an ATP and it happens to glance the outside and then go in, that would be out of bounds because it hit the post. However, any other part of the net is in play. So if I hit this ball, it clips the net and then goes over, that's completely fine and legal, and you would play that ball. There is one exception to this rule. This is a permanent net, so it doesn't have this metal bar at the bottom, but on a lot of temporary nets you might be playing on, there's a big metal bar across the entire bottom. If you hit the ball, it clips the net, goes over and hits that metal bar, that would be a replay. You'd actually just pretend like that point never happened and you'd start from the beginning.
Another big misconception is how touching the net works in pickleball. And basically, there's one rule. If you touch the net, you immediately fault in every scenario all the time. That sounds simple, but there's some reasons it's kind of complicated. We'll go through a couple examples that actually are illegal and most people don't think that they are. The first common scenario is when you're running up to the kitchen or near the net and you use the net to recover and push yourself back into play. The problem is the moment you touch that net, you've actually just ended the point. So avoid it whenever possible, even if you're running towards the net at full speed. The next likely scenario is during an Ernie, because your paddle touching the net is also a fault. Typically, when you're going for an Ernie, your forward momentum is going to carry you towards the net, but you can't make any contact with the net when you're hitting the ball. This usually happens when they hit a very close dink to the net and you want to Ernie the ball. If the ball is just over the net and you happen to hit the Ernie, still goes in, the paddle cannot make contact and brush the net when you're following through, or even before you touch it. That's still a fault, even though I hit a successful Ernie.
If you've played pickleball before, you've probably been in an argument over this exact scenario. So many people think that you cannot go into the kitchen before the ball bounces. That's just completely inaccurate. The only time you can't step in here is when you're about to make contact with the ball out of the air. But even in that scenario, you can stand in here all day. You just can't make contact with the ball before it bounces. This is actually the non-volley zone. Officially, it's not the kitchen. That's just a more colloquial name. But non-volley zone, you cannot volley while in this zone. That same rule applies when your toes are just barely over this line. If you reach in and take a ball out of the air, you're officially in the non-volley zone, so you can't do that.
And continuing that thought, a lot of people don't realize that their paddle is part of their body and includes the non-volley zone. So let's say a ball is coming that has me reaching down low to defend. I might try a block that's going to shove my paddle into the kitchen. Even though my feet are outside, the moment my paddle volleys and touches the kitchen in the same motion, that is still a fault. Another common scenario is going for a smash, but you're standing outside of the kitchen. Your follow through cannot make contact with the kitchen on the way down. Once again, that's another fault.
Sometimes you might run into this scenario where an object that was in your pocket or on your body falls into the court. So maybe your hat falls off or like a towel falls out of your pocket. That's completely fine. That is now a part of the court, and if the ball hits that, we just continue playing like normal. The only time that an object falling off of your body actually impacts the play is if it happens during a volley and it lands into the kitchen. So if this was for some reason in my offhand and I volleyed a ball and it landed into the kitchen, that's a fault. Otherwise, not a fault ever.
Another common misconception is that people think you have to stick with the same hand that you're playing in the entire match. So for instance, let's say I hit a forehand, but then someone hits really far out wide to me and I decide to hit left-handed, so I transition my paddle to my left hand and then make contact with the ball. That's actually completely legal. You're welcome to do that. You can throw your paddle around between hands as much as you want, but you can't take two paddles and play double at the same time. Sure, that would look sick, but that's illegal. Or let's say in some crazy scenario, my partner somehow drops his paddle during the match. I can't offer him my paddle instead for him to start playing with. Your paddle is your own and you can't just pass it around to your teammates, as much fun as that would be.
Here's a question you've probably received before playing pickleball. Can you throw your paddle to hit a ball that you couldn't normally reach? And the answer is no. You cannot throw your paddle in hopes that it'll hit a ball and then make that ball go over the net. This paddle, when it makes contact with the ball, has to stay in your hand at all times. However, if you do hit a ball and then it comes out of your hand, that's completely okay, except for one scenario. If you take a volley out of the air and then your paddle drops into the kitchen, that would be a fault. But if you take a volley out of the air and your paddle falls outside of the kitchen, totally fine.
Another really common misconception has to do with double hits or carries. So you know that feeling when you hit a ball, but it kind of rolls off your paddle as you hit it, maybe makes a weird sound and then flies back with a ton of power on the other side of the court. Typically, that's going to be a carry. Any ball that stays too long on your paddle's face and then goes over the court is considered a carry. It has to make single contact with the paddle and then go over. Or, as of 2024, there's actually another scenario which is kind of fun. Double hits are allowed. So you can't carry the ball. It can hit twice and then go back over the net, as long as it's one continuous motion and you're not like trying to spike it or something. But the moment you happen to hit it more than twice, once again, that's considered a carry and that's going to be a fault every time.
Another obvious but misunderstood rule is that the ball can only touch one of your paddles. So it can't touch my paddle and then my partner's. This may seem obvious, but there are scenarios where you just barely tip the paddle and then your partner returns it. In that case, it hit both of our paddles and that would be a fault. There is a very rare scenario where that ball comes to the middle and you both swing and you both hit the ball. Although hard to see, that would also be a fault. But in this same scenario, if I were to hit the ball and he hits the back of my paddle, completely fine, that's legal. There is a pretty infamous rule, but also applies to that scenario called the 2 becomes 1 rule. So if I'm outside of the kitchen, that ball's coming here, I make contact, but my partner's in the kitchen and he hits my paddle, now 2 becomes 1, we're connected, he's in the kitchen, we're volleying the ball, that's a fault. Really unusual that this would happen, but it does happen and did happen pretty recently.
Another really commonly misunderstood rule has to do with a volley serve. If you don't know, a volley serve is when you hit the ball out of the air as part of your serve. Most people actually choose to serve like that, but they think it has to be a perfect drop in order to hit a serve. But for a volley serve, you're actually not locked into a drop. You're welcome to toss it up and then hit it. You can even hit it as high as this. The only thing you can't do is add spin with your hand. So I can't take the ball and twist it and then serve. I have to throw it straight up, but I can add spin with my paddle when I make contact. And the last thing, every serve still has to be a low to high motion. So just because you threw it up in the air, can't hit any overheads. You have to do a low to high motion for the serve to be legal. But if you do want to hit a high to low serve for any reason, you can hit a drop serve and then hit downward on the ball instead of upwards.
Another misunderstood concept in pickleball is what happens if you're saying the score and you call it wrong. A lot of people will serve the ball after calling the score wrong, play a couple shots in that rally, and then just randomly stop it and try to address it. You can't do that. Once you call a score, even if it's wrong, you just have to finish the rally and then correct it before the next rally. The exception for this is if you somehow happen to catch it before the return of serve. So let's say the score is 1-1-1 and I call it 1-1-2 and I serve and my opponent stops it before the return, that's totally fine. You can correct the score and just replay that. But really weird, if they tried to correct it and it was actually right and they thought you called it wrong, you get a free point.
Speaking of serves, another really weird scenario is when you hit a serve and it hits the nets, but it bounces into the kitchen. That is actually a fault. Any serve that lands within the kitchen boundary is considered out. Even if it makes contact with the white line, the entire line of the kitchen is still considered out. So even if it's close, it's definitely out. So let's say I hit a serve. The ball travels all the way to the net, bounces, rolls, but makes contact inside of the kitchen. That's still considered out. That ball, if it were to land right there after making contact with the net, is still considered out. Essentially what happens when the ball makes contact with the net is nothing. The serve is played as it is. So there's no lets in pickleball. If you were to hit a serve, it bounces and still lands in the blue, that's a legal serve and your opponent needs to play the point as usual.
This one seems obvious, but it comes up quite often. Can you be out of bounds and make contact with the ball? Yeah, you definitely can. In fact, this happens every time you serve a ball, you take it out of the air. But for some reason, it just feels weird to be standing out of bounds and hit a ball that's coming out of bounds out of the air. If you happen to do that though, just keep playing because that's totally legal and the rally should continue to play. Another place this actually happens all the time and no one really considers it is if you're doing an Ernie. You're standing completely outside of the court and making contact with the ball. This is totally fine. Last misconception, you can hit your opponents with your serve and it's your point. This is called the nasty Nelson. There was this dude named Tim Puppet Master Nelson. Here's a clip of him. He popularized this one time by hitting a serve. It went all the way over here and instead of going into the legal court, it just hit his opponent. And because it hit his opponent, that's a point.
The only thing is we don't actually recommend doing this shot. It's kind of mean. You're just targeting some player and hitting them in the face or the body. So probably don't do that in your rec games, but technically, legal shot. And those are the 20 biggest misconceptions in pickleball. If you want even more tips, subscribe to our newsletter. It's linked right here. And maybe check out this video. We'll see you in the next one.